This is the second part of the $4 billion Arab loans affair that was set up as a joint CIA MI6 sting in 1975 to destroy Dr. Jim Cairns and Prime Minister Gough Whitlam of Australia. These events occurred in 1975, and Danny Casolaro was investigating the evidence provided to him by Michael Riconosciuto. And this is the continuation to show the conspiracy and evidence that I've gathered from the official parliamentary records of the Australian Federal Government during their inquiries and questions in the House, and the newspapers, and also the articles of association, cross-directorships and documentation that will provide overwhelming evidence that this was a joint CIA MI6 sting to destroy a democratically elected Australian government in 1975. So let's begin our journey. Over 25 years I've been interviewing Michael Riconosciuto via letters from prison and also recorded interviews with Michael. And during this time, I have always been able to confirm that he's telling the truth and that I can find independent evidence that substantiates his claims. So let me show you what I've recorded in my interviews with him over 25 years. He's consistently told me the same advice and evidence that he was providing to Danny Casolaro, and this is what he has said categorically to me. It was Sir William Dennis Kendall and Frank Colucci that orchestrated the joint MI6 and CIA sting to set up the $4 billion Arab loan scandal and the Sunshine Migrant Services scandal involving Sir Harry Gillam, Eric Searcals, Robert Booth Nichols, and Michael Hand, the founder of the Nugan Bank. So let's continue. Michael categorically confirms that he says, I was a personal friend of Sir William Dennis Kendall, and I was working with him on many secret military R&D projects. Sir Dennis Kendall was a famous MI6 spy working undercover as a double agent for Winston Churchill during the World War II. And he tells me that he was sleeping with the mistresses of the Nazi officers in order to gather confidential intelligence that assisted Churchill with the war. I have also interviewed, we've got the recorded interviews with Michael's wife, who sadly, Bobby, has passed away, where she confirms that she would visit Sir Dennis Kendall's house with Michael with the children. And so Michael's not making this up. It is confirmed. I've also validated this with an Australian who was a close associate of Michael, also involved with intelligence, confirming that yes, Michael was a friend and communicating directly with Sir Dennis Kendall. Michael states categorically, I was with Sir William Dennis Kendall at his house in the United States when he was on the telephone speaking directly to the British Prime Minister Harold Willson and the Queen, and they gave him permission to proceed with the joint CIA and MI6 intelligence sting to destroy the Whitlam government. Despite all of the denials of the palace letters, this is witnessed by Michael, that this whole sting was cleared by the Prime Minister of UK and the Queen for Sir Dennis Kendall to lead the joint MI6 CIA sting with Frank Colucci and Ted Shackley. So if we have a look at the components from part 1, I've confirmed to you categorically that the video that I provide in the podcast, number 1, Sir Harry Gillam is talking about the sting and the role that he played with Eric Searcals, giving testimony from his apartment at 5 Half Moon Street, Mayfair, and I prove to you that on the license to carry a concealed machine gun by Robert Booth Nichols, he has that listed as his address in UK, 5 Half Moon Street. And that's the apartment they're selling all the documents to the UK media with Rupert Murdoch and the Australian media with The Age, the damaging memos that are tabled in the House to destroy Dr. Jim Cairns. Michael confirms that involved Ted Shackley, Frank Colucci, Michael Hand, and I've proven in the first podcast that the documentation at the time with Henry Kissinger and Gerald Ford confirm that the Arab loan that's being provided, the $4 billion, that William Colby had been meeting with Prince Fahd in Saudi Arabia only the year previously, that he's lending his support to the United States. But I'm going to go further and show you that there is overwhelming evidence to show that this is a joint sting, and the role that the parties played in destroying first Dr. Jim Cairns and then finally Gough Whitlam to bring down the government, with overwhelming multiple letters and finance letters being provided in order to destroy the government. Fabricated letters that keep appearing in the media and in the parliament being tabled. I have a diagram here. It's only a very small part from a huge mosaic that I have over 21 years, but this is focused just on the loans affair. And this is the new evidence I'm going to present to you today. We have categorically already shown in part 1 that Harry Gillam, Eric Searcow's Group Captain Michael Stevens meets with Dr. Jim Cairns over in Paris, and Michael Cullen Simpson, who's working on arms deals in Saudi Arabia with the Saudi Arabian government and the British Embassy, which I have proved to you, is directly involved in setting up this $4 billion Arab loan through banks in the UK and also in the US, and all the damaging letters that they're providing that are being sold to the media. They're working directly with Frank Colucci, and now we're going to show you that Sir William Dennis Kendall, is orchestrating on behalf of the UK Prime Minister Harold Wilson, cleared with the Queen Elizabeth, that they can proceed to destroy the Whitlam government, a democratically elected government in 1975, destroying Dr. Jim Cairns, Prime Minister Gough Whitlam, and this embarrassing $4 billion Arab loans affair with documents and banking statements and all the people involved. The new people I'm going to bring in is Sonny Facilis. He's the owner of Commerce International Company Inc., an arms dealer. Now, what the Australian public doesn't understand is this $4 billion Arab loan is being orchestrated by MI6 and CIA through an arms company. An arms company coming to the rescue of the Australian Whitlam government to provide this $4 billion Arab loan. And I'm going to show you that Sonny Facilis is linked with the Mafia, CIA, and with the Golden Triangle with Ted Shackley, William Colby, William Willson, Thomas Clines, but more importantly, Paul Halliwell, with Castle Bank, Mercantile Bank Trust, Resorts International, and the Nugan Bank. And also a sheikh, an ambassador in London. This Saudi Arabian ambassador is identified as facilitating the loan that these guys, Michael Stevens, Group Captain Michael Stevens, working with Rolls-Royce in Paris with arms deals with the Saudi Arabian government, Michael Cullen Simpson, Saudi Arabia, together with Harry Gillam and Eric Searcow's and Sir Dennis Kendall are arranging this Arab finance with the Sheikh, an ambassador in London, with Commerce International Company, with Sonny Vasilis, an arms dealer Thomas Yu in Hong Kong, working with Commerce International Company, the managing director Gerard Corder, and yes, a US ambassador from State Department just stepped down with the title of ambassador, acting as a consultant to clear this loan, all the way to the top of the US government. And two other arms dealers that are in Hong Kong, and I think it was over in Holland, and a company over in Brussels and Belgium, is that they're all representatives of the same company, Commerce International Company. And I'm going to show you that this was all orchestrated as a mafia CIA banking link that's selling the drugs from the Golden Triangle with Chiang Kai-shek family in Taiwan in their alliance with CIA through Nugan Hand Bank. So Michael categorically states it was Sir William Dennis Kendall, Frank Colucci that orchestrated the joint MI6 CIA sting to set up the $4 billion Arab loan scandal and the Sunshine Migrant Services housing scandal to implicate Dr. Jim Cairns, their primary target, and Gough Whitlam, given their opposition to Pine Gap, that's spying on the Australian cabinet and ministers and all their communications on our soil in Australia, also opposing the bombing of innocent civilians in Vietnam, and part 3, which I will do shortly for the final part, is that they were also opposing the planned invasion of East Timor and the slaughter of innocent East Timorese citizens, involving Ted Shackley, Thomas Clines with their death squads. And this was all endorsed and supported by President Gerald Ford and Henry Kissinger. So there were 3 reasons to destroy him, but I'm going to concentrate on the second one, and that is the role of Sir Dennis Kendall, the Queen, the UK Prime Minister, together with CIA, to bring down the democratically elected Whitlam government. So who is Sir William Dennis Kendall? And it turns out that he was the owner of British Manufacture and Research Co., an arms company, during the Second World War, and he then became a politician and was elected for the British National Party. He was known to be a fascist sympathiser with suspected German links and possible involvement in an arms trafficking, and his notorious indiscretions, which Michael has talked about, sleeping with all of the mistresses of the German Nazis in order to gain intelligence. And it says here in 1942, MI5 security service files describe him as larger-than-life figure. And so Sir Dennis Kendall's wife, Virginia, and I found this in one of the quotes for the family members, was my first cousin. Virginia was tall, lithe, red-haired, very large, expressive blue eyes, charming with the grace of a dancer. She was cheerful and a real tease with the small boys like me. So this is the cousin. They both, I believe, were dual citizens, and so needed to touch base in both America and the UK. We knew that Virginia worked for the OSS, the early CIA. But all we knew beyond that was that she was attached to the Manhattan Project, and the marriage ended in divorce. So here's the links with the US intelligence for CIA. In the light of recent evidence about Dennis, one wonders of his reasons and disaffected wife was recruited by OSS. I suppose we'll never know. One also wonders if she was up to something on those New York visits. One has to make certain allowances for the fact that he was passing secrets to the US. But I suppose the British can take a dim view of even that. Seems to me more like industrial espionage. So we know that Sir Dennis Kendall had affiliations with his wife with CIA. She returned to Paris after war and she met and married Colonel Thomas Davis, then attached to the NATO headquarters. So this is coming from a family member. And so Sir Dennis Kendall and his links with Michael. And I've interviewed Ray Levasse, who worked with Michael and also with Ted Gunderson. And he independently confirms. When the Americans decided to change the tide of the war, Osman bin Laden was brought to the US under false name of Tim Osman. Osama then met with 3 men in Sherman Oaks, California. Among them was Ted Gunderson, a retired FBI agent who had been approached by a high-level official in the administration of President Ronald Reagan to provide outside government channels assistance to the Afghan Mujahideen. In 1986, Ted Gunderson then arranged a meeting between himself, Michael Riconosciuto, and Ralph Oldberg. Michael Riconosciuto was the architect of the Promus software who was closely involved with Hubble's Park-on-Meter operation, and Ralph Oldberg covertly represented State Department and the Middle East. And goes on to say that Ted Gunderson's role was to put the key players in contact, and here it is, with Sir Dennis Kendall, a former member of British Parliament and a double agent during World War II who had worked for both Germans and the British. So we have confirmation from Michael's wife, who sadly has passed away, that while he was in prison we were interviewing her, and she confirmed that they were visiting the house of Sir Dennis Kendall with their children all the time. So Michael had a close association with Sir Dennis Kendall. And after leaving Ted Gunderson in California, Michael Riconosciuto, Osman bin Laden, Mark Oldberg and Sir Dennis Kendall travelled to Boston and met with Abdullah Azzam, and the details were further formulated. Interpol provided secure communications and kept operation formalised with a number of unnamed congressmen from being compromised or discovered. The project ultimately provided the Afghan resistance with 600 Stinger surface-to-air shoulder-fired missiles, which had been modified so they could not be used against American aircraft if captured. Ted Gunderson confirmed that these weapons turned the tide of the battle in Afghanistan against the Soviets, whose aircraft and particularly attack helicopters fell victim to the missiles. And we have our recorded interviews with Ted Gunderson confirming that this is all true. So Michael is not lying, that he did have a close relationship with Sir Dennis Kendall, not only in terms of modification of the Stinger missiles to help bin Laden when he was recruited and working originally with CIA when fighting the Soviets, but he witnessed. So let's go back. Michael witnessed. He was at the house, at Sir Dennis Kendall's house, present when Sir Dennis Kendall was on the telephone talking directly to the British Prime Minister Harold Wilson and the Queen, and they gave him permission to proceed with the joint CIA MI6 intelligence sting to destroy the Whitlam government. So you can't make things up like this. The other thing is that I've got all the records of Danny Casolaro, his research files, and as you can see in all my previous podcasts, Michael had advised him that it was Frank Gallucci and Robert Nichols with the CIA and MI6 agents that orchestrated the $4 billion Arab loans affair to destroy the Whitlam government in 1975. And in the transcripts and outlines of the book that he wanted to write about the octopus, he had one of the first chapters was the dismissal of Gough Whitlam, the $4 billion Arab loans affair. He was then going to cover the links with the octopus with the Nugenham Bank, its role in October Surprise, its links with Wackenhut, Cabs on Arms and casinos, Fidco with Robert Mayhew, George Pender, and its links with Mafia, Yakuza, meddling cartels, CIA, NSC, the Costigan Royal Commission. He was planning to come to Australia. He wanted to interview Costigan over the commission of their investigation of the drugs and arms involving the painters and dockers bringing arms and drugs into Australia during Nugenham Bank. He also was exposing BCCI, had the BCCI checks, looking at the evidence of the Iran-Contra arms and drugs that had been sold. He had the memos for a $2 billion brokers of death arms and drugs deal. He had the Indochina report, which shows the Proma software used for Swift banking and money laundering of drugs and arms, and particularly the drugs coming through the Golden Triangle of Burma. And also intimate knowledge he was going to follow through. CIA's Proma Swift banking software was stolen and sold to the Australian government. So this is part 2, which I dedicate again to Danny Casolaro, because he was planning to expose all of this. He had the evidence. And part 2, I'll show you, building on part 1, we've already proven that the links of William Colby, Ted Shackley, Frank Colucci, Henry Kissinger were directly linked to Harry Gillam, Eric C. Cowles, Robert Booth Nichols and Michael Hand, in order through the brother of Jim Cairns, with the Sunshine Migrant Services embarrassment, together with the $4 billion Arab loan, forced Dr. Jim Cairns to resign and then continued discrediting Gough Whitlam, which had him dismissed. In the first podcast, I've shown categorically the role of Group Captain Michael Stevens, meeting with Dr. Jim Cairns to facilitate the Arab loan, and I'll show more evidence I have that he was representing Rolls-Royce in the current dealings with the British and American arms deals for the Air Force. And this was all played out on the front page of the newspaper and continued through Parliament to the embarrassment and forced resignation of Dr. Jim Cairns and eventually Gough Whitlam. The video is the recording. He's selling it from 5 Half Moon Street. He's doing the interview at 5 Half Moon Street. Even the papers are showing that Eric C. Cowles claiming that he was a spy working with MI6, CIA, and that he'd fabricated all of the evidence to destroy Jim Cairns. There's a picture in the first podcast, 5 Half Moon Street. Harry Gillam was known as Double Deuce, MI6 famous Second World War spy working with Sir Dennis Kendall. Of course, the document shows that he's licensed, and I don't know if you know anyone that has a license to carry a concealed machine gun, but Robert Booth Nichols did, and the addresses in Australia that he had was at 8 Sandford Street, St. Lucia, Queensland, Australia, and he also had his registered address as 5 Half Moon Street, Mayfair, London. The same apartment that sold the loans affair documents sold to the media, tabled in Parliament to destroy Dr. Jim Cairns and Gough Whitlam, our Prime Minister. So, also, as you know, in previous podcasts, a mystery stakeman comes to Australia in 2004, makes threats against my life, and I have no idea who he is, but claims that he was the owner of the Baron of Beef restaurant and guest house up in the Dandenongs, and it was used as a safe house for CIA and the Mafia during the Nugenham Bank era. And after I prove, he tells me that I'm upsetting some powerful Israeli businessmen, that if I don't stop, I'll get a crowbar to the back of the head or have the military coming down on me, and all my problems in Australia lead directly to Alexander Haig. I still don't know who this man is. That's a picture of who met me, and it wasn't until I was interviewing Ray Levasse and described what had happened, and he told me, he said, get yourself a copy of Under Siege with Steven Seagal, and it's Robert Booth Nichols. It's Robert Booth Nichols who was helping Danny Casolaro to expose all the scandals in Australia and BCCI and the promo software. And there he is. That's exactly the man that came to Australia and made those threats against me in 2004. That's all covered in podcast number 3, The Mystery Steak Man. I have independently also multiple podcasts I've done, part 1, 2 and 3 of the Nugenham Bank links with drugs and arms, and have proven beyond doubt Michael's testimony. I have all the definitive documents, incorporation and records of Nugenham Bank, the Royal Commissions, the parliamentary inquiries and the incorporation documents, and Michael was working across with his partner, Paul Maraska, who was murdered. They were providing and assisting Mark Rich, Edmund Safra, and CIA were moving processing of minerals to Australia. They were being shipped across from Utah to Australia, processed and put through the Perth Mint, and it was linked to the mining companies of Michael Hand, Frank Nugan, Jeff Stokes, the common director, and they were working directly with Southern Goldfields with Peter Briggs, and again the same chairman, Jeffrey Stokes, was the same chairman and director across with the gold mining companies owned by Michael Hand and Frank Nugan. It also came out in the Costigan Royal Commission in Australia, investigating the involvement of CIA with drugs and arms through the Painters and Dockers Union, proving that the links were all back to the Mafia, the Gambino Mafia, back to the Cabazon. Eventually, we find the links of Mafia, CIA, with John Nichols, Thomas Marsden, and of course Michael also owned another company called Certec with Richard Secord and Albert Hakim. You can't make these things up. I also have the testimony of an Australian businessman who had Robert Booth Nichols and his wife staying at his house in Perth, David Wright, and confirms categorically that they were setting up and selling a new assault rifle and machine guns that Robert Booth Nichols was selling to SAS in Australia for anti-terrorist activities, but he was also selling it to the Philippine military and also Kuwait government. And back in Michael's original testimony is that these are the FBI records showing that the murder of his business partner. In 1982, Paul Maraska, they discovered there were 35 sheets of paper bearing financial accounts and transactions for Atlantic Bank Trust and Company and Banco Pariente, Geneva, Switzerland, which Michael said is the transactions for the minerals that they were doing with Edmund Safra and Mark Rich with the minerals and processing of gold. And in the media, there was definitive links of the Mafia owning the Cabazon Casino with Dr. John P. Phillips, CIA operative, who is actually involved in the arms deals and the drugs that are going to be laundered through Nugenham Bank in Australia, together with the Cabazon Casino. So the trail of following the money is undeniably CIA linked with the Gambino Mafia and the murder of Michael's business partner. So let's skip on from there. That's all covered in previous. This is the new evidence. This joint CIA MI6 sting was cleared by the UK Prime Minister and the Queen. It was orchestrated from America by Sir Dennis Kendall with his links with CIA, and he was using former MI6 operatives Harry Gillam, Eric Siakals, and together with Frank Colucci, they were using Robert Booth Nichols and Michael Hand, and Ted Shackley, William Colby, Henry Kissinger, and Gerald Ford had endorsed the whole operation to remove the Prime Minister of Australia and the Treasurer of Australia, a democratically elected Australian government, an ally of the US and the UK. So let's now start our journey. Here is the 4 billion Arab loan. I've covered all this in previous podcasts, part 1. I'd like to now show you the intricate link over here with the CIA and the Mafia in an arms company, Commerce International Company, offering to establish a 4 billion line of credit to Gough Whitlam and Dr. Jim Cairns. Here is the official Hansard of our Federal Parliament, Wednesday the 9th of July 1975. I'm highlighting the key players for the 4 billion loan with the arms company. There's Mr. George Harris, Mr. Leslie B. Nagy from Australia and London, with Alcoa International, just a mining company. And it confirms that this line of credit for 4 billion is being endorsed by His Excellency Sheikh Abdul Ram Al Halasi, who's the UK ambassador from Saudi Arabia, working directly with Prime Minister Harold Willson and the embassy. He's based in London, orchestrating this $4 billion loan of credit through Commerce International Company, an arms dealing company with selling arms to Saudi Arabia and controlled by CIA and the Mafia. And the key person is the managing director, is Anthony Fensor, and a mystery man who disappears. Everyone says he's a mystery. He's there. I found him. But the managing director of Commerce International at the time is Gerard Corder. In fact, it's Dr. Gerard Corder. And this is the facilitation of a $4 billion Arab loan from London. Here is the letter tabled in the House at the time, making allegations that Dr. Jim Cairns had given approval for a commission on this loan that claims that he signed it, but he says he hasn't signed it. But the letters that are fabricated are saying that he's approving a commission that's going to involve Commerce International Company Inc. for a $4 billion Arab loan. In addition to that, not only are they attacking that he's approving this 2.5% commission for the parties involved for brokering it, but also reminding him that Dr. Philip Cairns, the brother of Dr. Jim Cairns, is involved in the Sunshine Migrant Services contract and project that's got embarrassing memos being released by Eric Siakals and Sir Harry Gillam from 5 Half Moon Street, Mayfair, selling those papers to the media, Rupert Murdoch's media and the Australian media, to embarrass the government and have them tabled in-house, causing Dr. Jim Cairns to resign. In addition, as I went through the Hansard, it shows all the other names that I'm going to show you. There's a Mr. Thomas Yu at Hong Kong, who is representing Commerce International, the arms dealing from Hong Kong for the same company that's providing. This name is very important. In addition, we've got confirmation that here are the letters, the people coming in, part of the loan. There's a Mr. Peter Rogers and Robert Cohen. They're shown to be linked to parties involved with drugs. being laundered through Nugan Bank. But let's stay focused on Ambassador Marion Smoke, who's acting as a consultant for this loan. He's a US former ambassador for the State Department. He's actually giving approval for this loan for this arms company registered in New York to provide a $4 billion loan to the Australian government. Who is Marion Smoke? Well, it says that he helped form a viable Republican Party in South Carolina. Goes through that he's a former military. It says here that he served in World War II, taught at West Point, and retired as a lieutenant colonel. So a military background, World War II. He served one term as state senator, then worked for the State Department in Washington from 1969 to 1974. He retired from the Department of State in 1974 with the title of ambassador. And he then started a legal firm, Shipley, Smoke and Henry, and you will find they've got direct links with intelligence and with the Republican Party. It says several years later he became the co-chairman on the Committee of Finance for presidential candidate Ronald Reagan, and then worked for President's transitional team for the Department of State in 1980. It also confirms that he was responsible for the transition of intelligence for Ronald Reagan. So there's your direct link. The person who's authorising and endorsing the loan in an official capacity back to the State Department, back to the Republican Party, back to CIA, is Marion Smoke, involved with setting up this $4 billion Arab loan for the Australian government in 1975. I found he was quite active. He had previously worked for President Nixon and also under Gerald Ford, quite critical here, and he was also working directly and communicating with Brent Scowcroft. Now, why do I bring those names up? There is a podcast showing you that after all of my investigations of the Promise software and tracking down that Project Hammer CIA operation Still Point at Citibank, the money laundering of all of the funds, the drugs and arms of Nugan Bank and BCCI and Bank Ambrosiano is going through Citibank. In 2004, while Michael Riconosciuto is communicating with me from prison about the dismissal of Gough Whitlam involving Robert Booth Nichols and Frank Colucci and Michael Hand, President Ford comes to my rescue, offering to negotiate a $100 million settlement for me. That's a separate podcast. He happens to be a director of Citibank. And during the negotiations of that settlement they're going to negotiate for me for fraud committed by the directors and parties of John Hopkins institutions, he confirms that Brent Scowcroft will be personally involved to negotiate that settlement with the Board of Trustees, with Gerald Ford. I think that's just too much of a coincidence. So here is confirmation of communications of Ambassador Marion Smoke and wife, and their meeting with President Nixon. And I found this really interesting. During their communications with President Nixon, they confirmed that they've had a personal invitation by the Shah of Iran. So we know that the Shah of Iran was endeavouring later on in 1978-79, 1980, to move over $1 billion of his funds through Nugan Bank in Australia. So we have a definitive link of all the parties closely linked to October Surprise, the links with the Shah of Iran, and the funds being moved out of Iran at the time, involving Michael Hand, Richard Secord, and also Bernie Houghton with accounts in Iran. He also, Marion Smoke, plays golf with Vice President Ford at the time. I thought that was a nice relationship there. We have the 1975 $4 billion Arab loans affair being set up under Gerald Ford and Henry Kissinger, with Ted Shackley, Frank Gallucci, Michael Hand in Australia, and the person endorsing it is Marion Smoke, who plays golf with Vice President Ford. Further on, I found that he also is a very strong anti-communist. He's written a book about the Red Locust, Soviet support for terrorism in southern Africa, and he's quite vocal on this particular area. He's written a book on that. He's even written letters concerns and about these matters. Further evidence here, state dinner. He's meeting with the ambassadors, and particularly from Saudi Arabia, and he's also involved with escorting the wife of the Vice President and the Vice President himself, Gerald Ford. So Marion Smoke seems to be quite critical to this setup of the loan in 1975. I also found that he likes writing letters to Honourable William Casey in 1985 as the director of CIA, expressing concerns about, matters in South Africa, the Republic of South Africa, and also likes writing letters directly back to President Reagan. So I think we have a key person linked to the state, President Ford, Brent Scowcroft, Henry Kissinger, intimately involved in endorsing this $4 billion Arab loan that's been facilitated by Sir Dennis Kendall, Michael Cullen Simpson, Group Captain Michael Stevens, Eric Ziakow's, Harry Gillam, working closely with Sir Dennis Kendall with the approval of the Queen and the Prime Minister, and they're all going to be doing it through London and America, New York, with Commerce International Company Inc. as the facilitator of this generous $4 billion loan. So now let's look more closely at the parties involved with Commerce International Company Inc. And it's confirming here in our House of Representatives the roles of the banks, Morgan Grenfell, London Merchant Bank, endorsing and supporting it with the approval and endorsements of Ambassador Marion Smoke, former Chief of Protocol for US State Department, giving the green light that this is an attractive loan for the Australian government for Dr. Jim Cairns and Prime Minister Gough Whitlam. Just highlighting there that there's no denying that this involves Commerce International Company Inc. and Dr. Gerard Corder and Ambassador Marion Smoke. It then tables in the House the embarrassing letter that is being negotiated with Commerce International Company with endorsement of Ambassador Marion Smoke, that this is calling into question the credibility of Dr. Jim Cairns and his links back with his brother Philip Cairns, who has business partnerships with Eric Ziakow's and Harry Gillam for this loan that's generously linked to the $4 billion Arab loan being facilitated through Commerce International Company Inc. And again, tabled immediately after is the follow-up with the Sunshine Migrant Services Proprietary Limited proposal with possible commissions and kickbacks. It turns out to be embarrassing. Paper after paper, tabling documents being leaked relating to all these loans, the $4 billion coming through New York finance brokers, and involving also Immigrant Savings Bank and Commerce International, the managing director of Commerce. And then there's all these suspicious people involved with Sunlight Trading in New York and Sunshine Trading with the Sunshine Migrant Service. So the letters and the titles and the commissions and the embarrassment is just mounting, document after document being tabled and provided willingly by all the participants in the loan from London and New York. It just doesn't stop. Investigators chased down where did the letters come from, and they traced it back to New York. Roy McCartney tracked the story back to a small office in Chinatown from which an original telex message was sent to Mr. Harris indicating that a $4 billion loan was available at 7.7%. When he traced the address, it's a 2-room office opposite Lung Fat Restaurant and Laundry Supply Company registered with Sunlight Trading, and it's in Chinatown. Funny that Mr. Fensaw's name with Sunlight Trading, and then there's confusion. Who is this person? This is a mystery man. He's working with Commerce International. He's also using a company that doesn't exist, and it's in one little apartment facilitating the $4 billion loan with Commerce International with the endorsements and support of Ambassador Marion Smoke. It proves embarrassing. Paper after paper, leak after leak, documents after document, but there's no denying it's all coming from Commerce International Company Inc., an arms dealer. So we have a complete list of arms dealers. And so I do my research on, well, who is Commerce International Company? It's linked apparently to Ed Willson, who's using this for trading arms as part of the arms deals with CIA with Ted Shackley, William Colby, Thomas Clines internationally. And I decide, let's look a little bit closer. And who is the founder and owner? He's known as Sonny Facilis. And in 1975, at the time where the loan is being provided for $4 billion, he's merging 21 subsidiaries and affiliates of Commerce International Company were merged into CIC International Limited China. And it says that he served as the chairman and president, and from his obituary I found he also served on the Far East Advisory Committee under President Ronald Reagan, President George H.W. Bush, and President George W. Bush. Now this is amazing. This is going right to the top. We've got Marion Smoke approving this particular loan. Later on, he's involved after October surprise in the election of Ronald Reagan. He's handling the transition team, including the transition intelligence team to be appointed under Ronald Reagan. And then we've got the owner of this company that's generously facilitating a $4 billion loan for Dr. Jim Cairns and Prime Minister Gough Whitlam that's being leaked. They're leaking all their documents and loans approvals to implicate Dr. Jim Cairns, forcing him to resign, is coming from his company with their arms deals with Saudi Arabia, China, Taiwan, Middle East, South America, Europe. Here's a copy of his website after he's passed away. I found that it still exists. It's been renamed CIC International Limited. It's started with British interests. Isn't that interesting that it started off over in Britain and it was headquarters in Shanghai? It originally was just trading silks and fur, and then it became a defence contractor. It then became headquartered in the US, New York. And what do they develop? State-of-the-art ammunition, vehicle modernisation, communication devices, kinetic energy, ammunition and defence technologies, including aircraft, massive aircraft contracts worldwide. And that just happens to be the Saudi Arabian arms deal for the Royal Air Force and the American Air Force contracts with Saudi Arabia at the time. It's amazing. I then do further searches on who is Sonny Vassilos, and it turns out that he was convicted and imprisoned for his links with the mafia and fraudulent securities. In 1969, linked to a huge insurance scam where he was using false securities, counterfeit bonds, and was convicted and put in prison. But more importantly, after World War II, he engaged in foreign trade. Sonny became a friend of Chiang Kai-shek, and this is very, very important. The Chinese military political leader. He helped them move to the islands of Formosa, which we now call Taiwan. Sonny formed Commerce International Company Inc., which developed close relations and expertise as a military contractor with the Republic of China. At the outbreak of the Korean War, the US found without adequate 90mm cannons on armed vehicles, so General MacArthur sought after Sonny and Commerce, his company, to fill the gap. And they were able to deliver 581 units to the army. But then we have a look at what else does it do. And the origins of the Korean War publication shows that Sonny Vassilos accused of passing bribes as the Vice President of Commerce International and was under indictment 10 years later when he resurfaced in a syndicated linked Guatemala scandal with the false securities. I then found his name popped up, the owner of this company, providing the $4 billion line of credit for Dr. Jim Cairns and Gough Whitlam in Sterling and Peggy Seagrave's book, Gold Warriors, America's Secret Recovery of Yamashita's Gold, is that he was closely associated with Wild Bill Donovan, the head of the OSS, the father of CIA. And here's your links with CIA. It says here, William Pawsley spent lavishly buying sugar plantations, an airline and a bus company when Fidel Castro seized control of Cuba from Batista regime. William Pawsley escaped to Miami, where he continued his alliance with Meyer Lansky. Isn't it interesting that we've got the CIA links going to the original Meyer Lansky, mafia links, using Miami Bus Company as his front. Meanwhile, Pawley helped Donovan persuade Texas right-wing oilman H.L. Hunt to support the KMT regime with millions of dollars for covert operations. William Pawley and William Donovan were aided in all of this by CIA's Alan Jules, Admiral Charles Cook, Ambassador William Bullitt, Brooklyn publisher Mr. Preston Goodfellow, former SOE agent William Keswick, and here you go, Sonny Vassilos, Vice President of Commerce International China, a subsidiary of Donovan's World Commerce Corporation. So we're now proving, beyond doubt, that the loan, the $4 billion loan involving Sir Dennis Kendall, Sir Harry Gillam, Eric Searcowes, Robert Booth Nichols, Frank Gallucci, Ted Shackley, Henry Kissinger, Gerald Ford, is being facilitated through a CIA arms company. It also shows that Sonny Vassilos, Air America, was dreamed up by William Donovan and Old China hands William Pawley, Whiting Willal, and General Claire Chennault. Now this is important. In 1930s, William Pawley had set up Central Aircraft Manufacturing Company, CAMCO, for Madame Chiang Kai-shek to assemble planes later were called the Flying Tigers. William Pawley was paid lavishly by Sheng regime and the Soong family and drug lord Du Yuesheng. In 1950, William Donovan and William Pawley bought out General Chennault and took over his beat-up airline. They persuaded China lobby to pay General Chennault $5 million for his airline, which was renamed Air America. The CIA drug-carrying airline throughout the Vietnam War. General Chennault then retired to Havana, where he went into business again with Meyer Lansky. William Donovan kept up his close ties to General Chennault and former Flying Tigers physician Dr. Margaret Chung, said to be a key link between the KMT drug generals and Bugsy Siegel. While the China lobby insisted that all narcotics came from the communist China, the KMT's General Tuan and General Lee, their opium-laden mule-train trucks and planes and airdrops over the Gulf of Thailand to waiting Taiwanese cargo and fishing vessels. And so now we have overwhelming evidence that Sonny Facilis is tied intimately into the Golden Triangle, with arms and drugs directly with the Nugan Bank. Now, in the next paragraph, this is incredible. If you watch my podcasts, you'll see that my journey goes through CIA Operation Still Point, Project Hammer at Citibank, using the Promise Swift banking software for money laundering of drugs and arms and gold bullion worldwide. Independent of me, Sterling and Peggy Seagrave jumped straight from Sonny Facilis to the next paragraph. One of William Donovan's top financial allies was poor Halliwell's frontman, General Earl Cockey, whose family had been in banking for generations. After World War II, Cockey served in the World Bank and IMF and as head of the American Legion, but also the board of CIA's banks such as the Nugan Bank. In April 2000, just 2 weeks before he died of pancreatic cancer, General Cockey agreed to give a legal deposition to the attorney of 6 plaintiffs who said they'd been swindled by former intelligence agencies of the South African apartheid regime. The scam was typical of many rackets run under part of Black Eagle Trust called Project Hammer, in which unsuspecting investors were encouraged to put up money for projects in third world countries, which then collapsed, swallowing their money. This is independent verification of everything that I've been putting forward as evidence of following the money. We've now got the link back to Sonny Facilis, the Octopus, CIA, Nugan Bank, that Danny Casolaro was chasing after. And it goes on to say, and repeats all the things that I've already revealed from Trail, the Following the Money, with the Promo software. In his deposition produced on LCDs that go with the book, General Cockey said he knew a lot about Black Eagle Trust, Project Hammer, because he had been part of William Donovan's spiderweb for decades. He testified that in 1990s he knew personally that Project Hammer had set up exceeding $1 trillion. General Cockey testified that no Project Hammer transaction could take place without the personal approval of, here we go, Citibank CEO John Reed. And hence, Michael Riconosciuto's writing from prison to me, telling me about the Whitlam government, Dr. Jim Cairns, the $4 billion loan, was set up by Sir Dennis Kendall and Frank Colucci with Ted Shackley, Michael Hand, Robert Booth Nichols, and also Sir Harry Gillam and Eric Sear-Cowles. And at the same time, in my life, US President Gerald Ford mysteriously appears, introduced by KPMG, my partners, who are the auditors of Citibank, and John Hopkins. And on the board of the audit committee is US President Gerald Ford and C. Michael Armstrong, the trustee of John Hopkins, as their chairman of the audit committee. No coincidence. And also advising that General Brent Scowcroft will be personally involved working with Gerald Ford to negotiate the $100 million settlement for my company that had been defrauded by the John Hopkins institutions. And here we have it. I had no problem seeing the President of the United States, but I could never get to see John Reed, says General Cockey. Reed was third in a string of Citibank CEOs groomed by William Donovan, and each mentor of the next, starting with George Moore, who was an OSS agent during the war, rising quickly to head Citibank, and after the war, Moore trained Walter Winston, and who trained John Reed. Ties between Citibank and CIA were always close, and a number of top spooks joined the bank when they left the agency, such as DCI Director John Deutsch, who was on the board of Citibank with Gerald Ford and C. Michael Armstrong, the chairman of the audit committee of Citibank and trustee of John Hopkins. And of course, he confirms, we've proven beyond doubt, that A.B. Krongard, the director of John Hopkins Medicine, that I'm suing and having launched a federal police investigation for fraud, is running Project Hammer, in the testimony given by General Earl Cockey. And so he says here that John Reed, who denies knowing anything about Project, has since left Citibank under a cloud to become head of US Stock Exchange. And so in the book, currently we have black gold is recovered from Japanese treasure vaults in the Philippines. It enters the world market through an agency in Australia and genetic ties to the Bank of England. First, the ingots are taken to Manila, where they are assayed by international gold buyers, one of whom is our source. Once satisfied with the assay, the brokers buy the gold at a deep discount, then airlifts and sea lifts it to Australia, where it is sanctified by Johnson Matthey Bank JMB, the UK gold bank that worked with President Marcos. This is independent verification of everything that Michael Riconosciuto has testified. His company was moving the minerals and gold through Australia with their company, with Paul Maraska, and they were doing it with companies tied to Michael Hand, Frank Nugan, and Southern Goldfield with Peter Briggs through Perth Mint in Western Australia. And following a major scandal with questions in Parliament, JMB was absorbed later by Bank of England, and 2 years later JMB bullion operation was sold to the biggest Australian banking, mining and bullion syndicate named Mace Westpac. And this is very important. Westpac Bank. We have overwhelming evidence that it was moving Marcos's gold bullion through Westpac Bank in the early 1990s. And I hold a letter that KPMG cannot pursue prosecution against John Hopkins because they're their auditors. That letter is given to me and also includes the communications I had with the chairman at KPMG, who were the auditors of Citibank and John Hopkins in the USA, and then are linked across to Westpac, which was fined $1.3 billion for knowingly allowing money laundering involving the Philippines for over 10 to 15 years. That fine was only a few years ago in Australia, and so it's still current. It says our gold broker source swears that upon reaching Australia the gold is resmelted to London and standard by J&B and then repapered by J&B and then simply joins the flow of newly mined gold shipped from Australia to the City of London where it enters the world market. That it appears to establish a direct link between gold laundering and the Bank of England. It goes on to say that sources in Manila also insist that Sir Evelyn de Rothschild, whose family is closely identified with the Bank of England, the US Fed and banks in Germany and France, is the true majority owner of Banquet gold mines in the Philippines. Now this is important. I will do another podcast because Banquet gold mines in the Philippines was acquired by Allen and Company only a few months before the attack on Pearl Harbor. And then, after the Second World War, providing all the gold bullion to the US Treasury. And then, with that wealth, they acquired control of Resorts International Casino in the Bahamas. And why is that company important? Because Allen and Company, the managing director, became the director of Rupert Murdoch's company, News Limited, that had the Promus software. And my podcasts show how true that is. But more important, the managing director, Stanley Schumann, was also the personal friend of Dr. Earl Bryan and financially backing Hadron Inc. and Simcom Inc., which had the Promus software, and modified that for Swift banking with News Limited's companies, Computer Power Group, and Wang Labs for William Casey to create the Swift banking software in Belgium and Virginia for tracking all Swift transactions worldwide, allowing for covert money laundering. And Michael independently testified in court in 1991 that the Promus software tapes were taken to Wackenhut by Peter Wiedniks from US Customs to be modified for Dr. Earl Bryan and CIA, to be put in at Transaction Technologies, a subsidiary of Citibank, for Swift banking. And it was renamed the Lean software and sold to the Australian government. And my podcasts prove that the Lean software was sold by Rupert Murdoch's companies to Australia. And it says here that there is nothing startling about that in and of itself, but the Banquet board has long been dominated by members of Imelda Marcos's Ramirez family, which still is today. Imelda's children had the use of the Rothschilds' mansion in London when they were attending school. As the biggest gold mine in the Philippines, Banquet always had been one of the primary channels for war-looted gold leaving Manila. During the Marcos years, a big piece of Banquet was acquired by a group of Wall Street venture capitalists, and I've proven that that's Allen and Company, who shared property ownership and a casino in the Bahamas with Mafia's Meyer Lansky. Isn't that interesting? Please watch my podcast, CIA Project Hammer, where I confirm all the details. The testimony of General Earl Cockey. The Promus software was installed at Citibank at Transaction Technologies and was used for moving all the gold, bullion, Marcos, and also the funds and drugs and arms money laundering from Nugenham Bank, Banca Ambrosiana, the World Bank, through Citibank. I won't spend much on this. I have a whole podcast on this. It confirms categorically this link is with the same octopus. Most importantly is Robert Booth Nichols is arrested later in 2006 and 7 trying to money launder $250 billion US security note linked to the Chiang Kai-shek family using the Promus software, and he's laundering it through Citibank, Bankers Trust, Deutsche Bank and Barclays Bank in London. You can't make this up. The octopus, the parties involved in destroying a democratically elected Australian government with Gough Whitlam and Dr. Jim Cairns, were destroyed because they were opposing the bombing of innocent civilians in Vietnam. They were upset that Pine Gap with CIA and NSA was intercepting and spying on the Australian cabinet and ministers and prime ministers' confidential communications, and were thinking of shutting down Pine Gap. And were also opposing the intervention of Indonesia and the Americans with the CIA backing to invade East Timor. And that will be part 3 for the motive for destroying them. This is all covered in my podcast on CIA Project Hammer at Citibank using the Promus software. Michael had told me and written to me from prison that the second application for the Promus software was modified, installed at Transaction Technologies Inc., a subsidiary of Citibank, for Dr. Earl Bryan, Hadron Inc. and CIA to move the covert funds through the automatic clearing houses. So we have got definitive proof. Podcast 1 covered the role of Frank Colucci, Robert Booth Nichols, Michael Hand with MI6 spies, and this one is proving that Sir Dennis Kendall, with the blessing of the UK Prime Minister and the Queen, were given permission to orchestrate a joint CIA MI6 sting to bring down a democratically elected Australian government, using their links with the mafia, money laundering of drugs and arms. And isn't it wonderful that the company facilitating this is an arms company to provide the line of credit of $4 billion with the Saudi Arabian government, with their ambassador based in London working with Prime Minister Harold Willson, and CIA. So we now have the parties involved. Sonny Facilis worked with William Donovan, Paul Halliwell, William Colby, William Casey. And it's all linked to the mafia. Mayor Lansky in turn was closely associated with Paul Halliwell, and also based in the Bahamas, who created a chain of CIA black money banks, and throughout the world, including Castle Bank, in the Bahamas, Nugenham Bank in Sydney and Honolulu, and BCCI International, now said to be reincarnated as Pinnacle. Paul Halliwell's ultimate boss during World War II was Wall Street attorney and former OSS chief William Wild Bill Donovan, who also was the boss of Alan Jules, William Colby, William Casey, and others who later became heads of CIA and an intimate friend of Mayor Lansky. This is independent verification of the joint MI6 CIA sting to destroy Dr. Jim Cairns and Prime Minister Gough Whitlam in 1975. Another name in the Hansard reported in Parliament is that there was a person by the name of Thomas Yu, who's linked and represents Commerce International in Hong Kong. And it says, Finally, the CIA itself provided an interesting hint there was some sleight of hand in the loans affair. The National Intelligence Daily, the CIA's intelligence gathering arm's top secret briefing document for the President, reported on the 3rd of July 1975 that Dr. Jim Cairns had been dismissed, even though some of the evidence had been fabricated. And ASIO, our Australian intelligence officer, writing for the Bulletin in 1976, concurred. He said that in his opinion some of the documents which helped discredit the Labor government in the last year in office were forgeries planted by the CIA. From the very start, the connection between Carrodus and Kalami was not clear. The line of finance seemed to pass through an Adelaide jeweller and opal dealer, one Tibor Shelley. Kalami, who was manager of Delamar and Sons, a London-based commodity firms, had learnt that the Australian interests through a friend, Theo Cranendock, a Dutch arms commodities trader, who in turn knew a Hong Kong connection of Tibor Shelley. It was Thomas Yu, another Hong Kong arms dealer. Yu's firm had a very close association with Commerce International, which is a very powerful Brussels-based armaments outfit with well-known links with the CIA. Now, I've been working on this research for 25 years, and the mosaic of the links, there are other elements that I know of, but this is the mafia link, this is the CIA link, this is the money people from Howard Hughes's empire and bankers with Fidco, with Robert Mayhew, Robert Booth Nichols, and with George Pender that I've covered extensively that Michael had been exposing. And it says here that Kalami, a novice in high finance, wanted to broker the loan, and in November 1974 flew to Australia. He arrived in Sydney on the 11th of November in the company of Theo Cranendock. Cardus was among those who met Kalami at Sydney Airport and took them to Rex Connor, so they're planting documents left, right and centre, different arms to implicate Dr. Jim Cairns and Gough Whitlam and other ministers. Kalami would say the first heard that the Australian government was interested in raising loan while he was visiting his friend Cranendock, who's the arms dealer representing Commerce International. Kalami was in Cranendock's office when a telex about the loan came through from Thomas Yu. So now we're going to have a look at another player whose name is Thomas Yu. And I found his obituary. During his years at the university, China was invaded and thrown into war. Tom was assigned to be a custodian of the university supplies and library, overseeing the transportation by barge of the Yangtze River to Chongqing and then on to Chengdu, where the university established itself during the war. After college, Tom started to work for the Chinese National Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, and his main job was to travel to Tibetan highlands by horse and foot to purchase wool. Isn't that interesting? Silk and wool. Commercial. He developed contacts with the local leaders and arrangements for the purchase. He also worked for the Bank of Commerce in Chongqing. After World War II, Tom worked for General Claire Chennault, here we go, and Civil Air Transport as the English interpreter, and then he became Assistant Comptroller for Civil Air Transport. And of course now this comes back to Air America and the planes flying the drugs. But it says for many years he worked for the Bank of America, with a natural career for him, having worked for Chongqing Bank of Commerce in the Foreign Exchange Department. He served as president of the American Institute of Banking and was a long-time member of Toastmasters International of Oxford. After leaving the bank, Tom went into business for himself, establishing Tom Yu Realty, which was a landmark. So we have the direct links back to the same parties with CIA, and they're the ones who are putting around the memos and bank credits. This is very interesting. Meyer Lansky in turn was associated with top CIA banker Paul Halliwell. also based in Bahamas, who created a chain of CIA blank money banks throughout the world, particularly Castle Bank in the Bahamas, the Nugan Bank in Sydney, BCCI. And so we're now coming really back to the round robin of the octopus. Nugan Bank, CIA operations, all the parties with Michael Hand, Robert Booth Nichols, Ted Shackley, to destroy Gough Whitlam and Dr. Jim Cairns. So we have overwhelming evidence. The Circle, Group Captain Michael Stevens, facilitating the Arab loan with Harry Gillam. The interview with Harry Gillam, he quotes that it's Michael, Group Captain Stevens was his link. This is the MI6 side, and the CIA side was definitely with Commerce International, and on the ground that's the New York side, and these guys are taking care of the UK side. And here we go, just going back in time, it shows that Michael Cullen Simpson of London sent a telegram for Sunshine Migrant Services and says, I've spoken with Her Majesty's Prince Saud bin Fahd, son of Prince Fahd bin Abdul Aziz, this evening, and the capital of Saudi Arabia, who will within 2 days establish official reception to the government loan request as advised. Please arrange immediate officials' letters for presentation and consider acceptable intermediate Swiss bank, which can be arranged. Regards, Cullen Simpson. And here are the main parties that were involved. Group Captain Michael Cullen Simpson, who's the arms dealer working with the Saudi Arabian government and the UK embassy. Eric Cowles, Peter Dean, Harry Gillam, and Group Captain Michael Stevens. We have now proven, and with the testimony of Michael, is that Sir Dennis Kendall, MI6, was authorised by Prime Minister Harold Wilson and Queen Elizabeth to orchestrate the joint MI6 CIA sting to destroy Gough Whitlam and Dr. Jim Cairns. And it was all facilitated to embarrass them, with all fictitious documents being dumped with the media to other politicians on the opposite side of the House in Parliament, to be tabled day in, day out, that it's embarrassing, that it's linked to arms deals, and all the parties are linked with drugs, arms, and CIA, and the mafia. And I found that this was the resume of Group Captain Michael Stevens. It shows that he had been a World War II hero, an ace in the Air Force, and that he also had worked with NATO, and he was the liaison to the American Air Force. But he was then representing Rolls-Royce in Paris, and this part's important because I went to the official Saudi Arabian arms deals taking place in the 70s, and we find the Saudi Arabian Air Defence Scheme, known as SAIDS, and with the Saudi Arabian Defence Consortium, which is British and American, involving Prince Turki bin Abdul Aziz and Northrop Aircraft, Lockheed Martin, and Rolls-Royce. Isn't that a nice, convenient consortium taking place where the arms contracts are in place and the Saudi Arabian ambassadors are going to offer the $4 billion line of credit with Commerce International Company Inc. And then I found in there, here is the records of Mr. M. Michael Cullen Simpson, who's a resident manager, and he's intimately involved with the UK embassy and the arms deals that are taking place with the Saudi Arabian government on the ground. It's his correspondence to UK. He's letting them know about current activities and negotiations with the Lords of the Admiralty, of Air Force and Embassy. He's on the ground directly communicating. And part of the records then show that there is obvious involvement of Lockheed and Northrop's agent Adnan Khashoggi. Isn't this amazing that deals are being done with the Americans for oil and exchange for defence contracts and kickbacks and bribes? This is all active through the late 60s, early 70s, leading up to the loans affair. But we've got all the people on the ground, all the people from the Octopus, Iran-Contra arms deals, the bankers for BCCI, Nugenham Bank. We've got all the parties together. And it's showing Khashoggi is now engaged representing Lockheed and Northrop. And guess who his partner is? Kamal Adam, the founder of BCCI. You can't make this up. This is the beginning of all the arms deals, the CIA banks, the money laundering of drugs and arms worldwide. And of course in there is the involvement of the contracts with Rolls-Royce, involving the interaction and concerns of the British Embassy, letters of credit, payments. And it says down here, Rolls-Royce representative Group Captain Willson advised that he understood that a Rolls-Royce representative would soon be sent to Saudi Arabia to assist with these negotiations. And we know that that is Group Captain Michael Stevens, who sets the loan up with Sir Harry Gillam with Saudi Arabia and sets the meetings up in Paris for Dr. Jim Cairns to incriminate him. So we have a complete circle. And this is the most beautiful letter that I found in the evidence, and you're going to love it. The approval of the $4 billion went through a bank in the Bahamas called the Mercantile Bank and Trust Company Limited. This was the damaging evidence that there was already approval and credit tabled in Parliament associated with this $4 billion with the Arabs, together with Commerce International Company Inc., the joint MI6 CIA sting to destroy Dr. Jim Cairns and Gough Whitlam. And here is the letter of the approval, the balances, Mercantile Bank. Don't you just love this little article over here? It says, the mark of the modern banker, a telex machine, stood outside Mr. Lightbourne's office in Mercantile Bank and Trust Company. 5 Bahamian girls and 2 whites worked to the Mossack in a long office beneath the gaze of Queen Elizabeth and the Duke of Edinburgh, portraits printed when they were very young. Pictures of 1 or 2 tankers hinted at Arabs and petrodollars. Nice people, a legitimate operation, but small, very small. An Australian could not help wonder why this country apparently moved to mortgage its future to the tune of $20 billion through this outpost in the Caribbean is putting the $4 billion up. Well, let's put the icing on the cake. It talks about what dealings did Canberra have with the Mercantile Bank and Trust Company of Freeport, Bahamas. A mysterious document passed to us in photocopy of a letter typed letterhead of this Bahamas firm, Private Mercantile Bank. It's dated April 28, 1975. And it's curious. It says, it described as a letter of intent and informs Mr. Vernon Bucolic in London that if the funding bank of his choice within 1 month will deposit the sum of 4,267,365,00 in a trustee account in New York. It's so specific and tabled as evidence in the House. Further damaging evidence to put the nail in the coffin, forcing Dr. Jim Cairns to resign and Gough Whitlam eventually to be sacked. And guess who owns the bank? Paul Halliwell. You've got Sonny Facilis's company facilitating the loan with the bank owned by Paul Halliwell, and William Colby, William Casey, all involved with the banking. Can you believe it? That the icing on the cake. And look who else Paul Halliwell worked with. Ray Klein, Richard Helms, E. Howard Hunt, Mitchell Verbal, John Singlaub, Lucia Conine, and William Pawley. My podcast on the fox in the hen house and the money laundering of drugs clearly shows that this is the octopus. It says here Halliwell's main job was to help Chiang Kai-shek to prepare the future invasion of communist China. The CIA created a pair of front companies to supply and finance the surviving forces of Chiang's KMT. Paul Halliwell was put in charge of this operation. This included establishing Civil Air Transport, Sea Supply Corporation, Bangkok. These were CIA-fronted companies raised money to help Chiang Kai-shek, and according to Joseph Trento, Prelude to Terror, through Sea Supply, Halliwell imported large amounts of arms for the KMT soldiers to keep the Burmese military from throwing them out of the country. The arms were ferried into Burma, and CAT airplanes were used. There were empty planes to fly drugs from Burma to Taiwan to Bangkok and Saigon. There the drugs were processed for the benefit of KMT and Chiang Kai-shek's corrupt government on Taiwan. Halliwell was replaced in this post by William Casey in 1945. Halliwell became chief of the Far East Division of the War Department Strategic Service Unit as an interim intelligence organisation formed after OSS was closed down. In 1947, Halliwell joined Central Intelligence. General Claire Chennault had a meeting with Harry Truman and advocated increasing Chiang Kai-shek and his Kuomintang Army KMT in its war on China. We now have the definitive link of all the parties. It shows that he was setting up the banks, and there it is. He first established Mercantile Bank and Trust Company, then Castle Bank and Trust Company. He also ran American Bankers Insurance Company and also set up the Intercontinental Holding, a company in the Cayman Islands that owned the Learjet that was used by Barry Seal for his drug running activities. He also established Sea Supply Corporation, and he was the relationship with the organised crime. This included Santos Trafficati, who are common business interests in successful exportation of Chinese white heroin. He then intimately involved with Frank Nugent and Michael Hand to set up the Nugent-Hand Bank, and another key figure in the venture was Bernie Houghton, who was closely connected to Ted Shackley, Thomas Kleins. And Nugent ran Operation Sydney, whereas Hand ran the operations in Hong Kong. This enabled Australian depositors to access money laundering facilities from Australia, money to Hong Kong, and according to Alfred McCoy, the Hand-Houghton partnership led the bank's international division into the fields of drug finance, arms trading, and support work for CIA covert operations. And this is important. Halliwell continued to work as a lawyer in Miami and served as legal counsel to Panamanian holding company that controlled the Bahamian gambling casino connected with Meyer Lansky. And he didn't die until 24th December 1976, a year and a half after the Loans affair. And there it is, crystal clear. It was poor Halliwell's bank that was putting the letter of credit up for the joint CIA MI6 sting with Commerce International Company going by Sonny Facilis, with their links with the Golden Triangle, CIA, Nugenham Bank, that provided the ammunition to shoot down and destroy a democratically elected government in Australia in 1975. I remind the listeners to my previous podcasts, particularly on the Nugenham Bank, part 1, 2 and 3, I have interviewed the daughter of Albert V. Carone, confirming the links of William Casey, William Colby with the Gambino Mafia, with her father, and the laundering of drugs through Australia with the Nugenham Bank. And she confirms categorically that it was Robert Mayhew, the director of FIDCO, with Robert Booth Nichols, who arranged for her to meet directly with Ted Shackley, and that Ted Shackley confirmed he personally knew her father, and he paid for the tombstone for her father. She also confirms that she received a telephone call from Richard Armitage warning her to remain silent about all matters involving her father. But more importantly, in detail, she confirms that her father, that Frank Nugen, Michael Hand, were good friends with her father. It was the bank used in Hong Kong area to launder different monies. There was General Leroy Manor, General Stilwell, poor Halliwell were involved. It was an operation where drug monies in different accounts from certain people were absconded with. And one through Nugenham Bank, and they were used for operations that were not sanctioned by US government, but they were considered black operations. And the drug monies that they used for cocaine trafficking, well, my father knew Frank Nugen and Michael Hand, but she does remember Michael Hand used to live in the Bronx area and knew her father. And in my podcast confirming the wonderful efforts of Daniel Sheehan, when the Christic Institute was endeavouring to sue Richard Secord, Ted Shackley, Richard Secord involved in money laundering of drugs through the Australian Bank, Nugenham Bank, and also arms and drugs through BCCI. There is no doubt that we now have the octopus was intimately involved in the CIA MI6 joint sting to destroy Gough Whitlam and Dr. Jim Cairns. This is only a small component of a huge mosaic, but now we have overwhelming evidence that it was sanctioned by the highest orders of the UK government, by the Prime Minister and the Queen, and by Gerald Ford, Henry Kissinger, Brent Scowcroft, and also Ambassador Marion Smoke, endorsing the whole process, with the funds going through Mercantile Bank and Trust, owned by Paul Halliwell. And so we have the complete circle. Michael's testimonies have been consistently correct and validated by me through government parliamentary records, corporate documents and interlocking directorships, the banks, the newspapers, the articles. You can't make these things up. Michael's link was not only with Dennis Kendall, but was direct with Michael Hand. For the laundering of Marcos's gold and drugs and arms worldwide, with Nugenham Bank and the casinos, with the Gambino Mafia and CIA. And of course, Ted Shackley, Ed Willson, intimately involved with Task Force 157, was really Office of Naval Intelligence, CIA. It was the sting and body used with the Nugenham Bank to destroy Prime Minister Gough Whitlam, Federal Treasurer Dr. Jim Cairns, for the democratically elected Australian government in 1975. And so there's the summary. It was Sir William Dennis Kendall and Frank Colucci that orchestrated the joint MI6 and CIA sting to set up the $4 billion Arab loan scandal and the Sunshine Migrant Services scandal involving Sir Harry Gillam, Eric Seacowles, Robert Boot Nichols and Michael Hand. He confirms I was a personal friend of William Dennis Kendall and working on many secret military R&D projects which were proven, but it was authorised and cleared by UK Prime Minister Harold Wilson and the Queen, despite the denials in the palace letters. Of course you're not going to put it in writing, but Michael was at the house of Sir Dennis Kendall when he was on the telephone and given the green light. And this concludes the evidence of the joint CIA MI6 sting to set up the $4 billion Arab loans affair, release the documents to destroy the democratically elected government of Australia in 1975. And so let's give credit to Danny Casolaro. Danny Casolaro was going to come to Australia to expose this loans affair, the Nugenham Bank, the Costigan Royal Commission, the overwhelming evidence that CIA was involved in the trafficking of drugs and arms through the banks in Australia. These are the overwhelming research files of Danny Casolaro, the evidence that he had been given by Michael, and his determination was to bring back the head of the octopus when he went to Martinsburg, and he was planning to travel to Australia and Burma to expose this octopus and its links with money laundering and trafficking of drugs and arms. I dedicate this second part to the memory of Danny Casolaro.